There are two ways that you can access the sketching environment. The first is through the 3D Model tab, and the second is through the Sketch tab. If you go to the drop-down, there is an option for a 3D sketch, but let's start with a 2D sketch. Upon selecting that, you'll be prompted to select a plane. It'll highlight green when you're hovered over it, and it'll have the name of which axis plane you're looking at. Once you start a sketch, you'll have additional options available for your sketching environment, including modify, pattern, constraint, and finishing the sketch. You'll also now see the sketch available in your browser. Let's explore the sketch toolbar a little more deeply. The first group of functions you'll see is create. This is to add a new element to your sketch. The only outlier here that I feel doesn't fit that description is fillet, which we'll go into detail a little bit later. The next section we'll see is modify. So these will be options of things you can do to change existing elements of your sketch, things like moving things, copying things, stretching things. The next section we'll see is pattern. So this is to multiply an existing element, create repeats within a sketch. So rectangular patterns, circular patterns, or you can also create a mirror image. The next group of things we'll say is constraint. That's adding rules to our sketches, making requirements or things that the sketch needs to adhere to. The last thing of note that I want to mention in that top ribbon is the Finish Sketch option. When you click that, it'll exit the sketch environment. The last thing to highlight here is back in our browser. We mentioned that our sketch is now available to view in our browser. If we want to rename our sketch, we can double click that while we're in our sketch mode, and it'll give us the option of renaming. If we want to reopen a sketch or edit a sketch after we've already hit that Finish/Complete Sketch button, we'll double click that sketch while we're not in sketch mode, and it'll bring us back to sketch mode. Exploring the Create options more deeply, each element will have a drop-down arrow, which will give you more details. So line is not only confined to straight lines, but could also create curved lines. You can use different elements of different details, different dimensions to create different figures. So depending on what information you're given or what information you have, you'll be able to approach your sketch differently. Our rectangle has a very broad range of options in the drop-down, so I encourage you to explore that. And the last thing I want you to keep in mind is that your point option is going to create a new point. This can be helpful if we need to snap to something. So we'll see that add holes to later to our 3D elements. Point is helpful to locate where you want the center of that hole. I mentioned fillet, that fillet was not the best location for it. It's almost more of a modification. What a fillet is softening an edge, softening a junction of meeting points. So let's say if we had a square and we wanted to round out the edges, we could fillet each of the edges. If you hit that drop down there, the next option is chamfer, and that's going to be to add a straight line that connects those rather than a curved line that connects those. Let's look at our sketch modification commands. So the leftmost column is move, copy, and rotate. Again, if you hover on any of these, you'll get bigger description on what they are. Move will move an object. Copy will move an object while still leaving the original object. So it's going to create a copy to the location you select. And rotate will rotate your object around a specified axis or a specified center point. Our next column of modifications is trim, extend, and split. Trim will get rid of the amount of line or curve after an intersection. Extend will add more line or more curve until you hit that intersection. And split will separate a part so that it is no longer one part but two parts, or no longer one curve but two curves. So essentially, you're breaking those two pieces apart based on where that intersection is. Our next three modifications are scale, stretch, and offset. Scale will increase or decrease the size of your sketch proportionally. Stretch will allow you to select either lines or points and drag them to move them to another specified point. And offset will duplicate with scaling. So for example, if you wanted to if you had a circle and wanted to create another smaller circle, you could offset that to get that duplication of a different scale. The next grouping of functions that we'll look at are the pattern functions. This will allow you to multiply an existing element within a pattern structure specified. So either with one element, you can create a rectangular pattern of that element, a circular pattern of that element, or you could mirror that element across a given line or axis. The next group of functions we'll look at are constraints. Our constraints are rules that we apply to our 2D sketches, or later we'll also see them applied to assemblies. The most common constraint to apply is a dimension. Dimension specifies either a length, an angle, specifies a value. It's going to be a value that you give. The next one I want to identify is coincident constraint, and this is a constraint that says 2 points must lay on the exact same spot. They must be the same point. The next most helpful ones I want to highlight are parallel constraint, perpendicular constraint, horizontal constraint, and vertical constraint. The last thing I want to look at in this video is setting constraint settings and toggling your constraints on and off, meaning making them visible for you. So going back up to that toolbar, on the leftmost column, that center one, that button is Show Constraints. It's a little constraint symbol with a light bulb. That's going to toggle your constraints on and off. Underneath that, we'll find a constraint setting button that will allow you to change settings for your display constraints, or change display settings for your constraints. At the very bottom of the screen, we're going to see a bar with a couple different logos. Some are constraint related, some are not. The second one is that same Show or Hide Constraint button that we just mentioned. There's also some short keys you can use for that. So F8 will show all constraints and F9 will hide all constraints. Same type of thing. If you hover over any of those buttons on the bottom, it'll tell you what the button is and how it works. Thank you, everyone. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to the next one.